Hi, and welcome to the third edition of What Hams Do, the TV show, and our first show of 2021. I'm your host, Jay Silber, WA2UAR, and I'm the Public Information Coordinator for the Eastern Pennsylvania section of the ARRL. Tonight's show is all about the use of our cars and mobile radios for emergency communications. We have an exciting lineup of guests and interviews for tonight's show, so let's look at what's coming up. We'll start off with a look at the news that affects amateur radio operators, and especially those here in the eastern 34 counties of Pennsylvania. We'll talk to three amateur radio operators who are deeply involved in emergency communications and the use of mobile operations to help the government and local agencies they serve when disasters happen. We'll explore the legislation proposed last year in Pennsylvania that could have restricted the use of amateur radio mobile operations in general and emergency use. And we'll talk about what to expect from the legislature this year. But before we move over to the newsroom, let's look at a message from the ARRL, the National Association for Amateur Radio.
He has spoken to China, Russia,
Здравствуйте, как дела?
and all over Europe. To scientists and world leaders, he's brought help in disasters.
Control. We have a 911 situation with the people trapped in the hospital.
And smiles to children. And he's never left home. He's a radio ham. Learn how at helloradio.org. ARRL, the National Association for Amateur Radio.
The lead story in tonight's show is the impending reintroduction of legislation in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives to restrict the use of handheld communications devices in vehicles designed to reduce accidents and deaths because of distracted driving. A similar bill introduced last year by Representative Rosemary Brown of Monroe and Pike counties failed when the legislative session ended before the Pennsylvania Senate could take up the bill. Representative Brown's original legislation did not exempt amateur radio operators from the restriction. Consequently, amateur radio operators could have been stopped by police for using their push-to-talk microphones in their cars, even if they were involved in emergency preparedness drills or actual emergency incidents. Since it did exempt commercial users of mobile two-way radios, we thought it might have been an oversight, and we began discussions with the Senate Transportation Committee staff to convince them to add language exempting hams from the restrictions. It looked like we were going to be successful, but then the legislative session ended. Your ARRL leadership team is in touch with Representative Brown's office and working with her staff to include language exempting amateur radio operators from the restriction. Once again, we are joined by our co-anchor, Frankie Bonte, call sign KE8HPA, now starting her second semester at Case Western Reserve University in Ohio. Frankie, what news do you have for us tonight?
In our last What Hams Do program, Jay, we reported on the ARRL's request to have all hams comment on the FCC's proposed $50 license fees for amateur radio exams. Now, the FCC has ruled, and despite the strong objections of amateur radio operators, license fees or exam fees of $35 will be charged for anyone taking an exam to become a ham, upgrading from one license level to another, or applying for a vanity call sign. The FCC has not yet indicated when this will take effect. Also, note that the typical $15 fee paid for the examiners who give the exam will remain in effect in addition to the $35 license fee.
I'll just mention, Frankie, that the FCC, in its reasoning, rejected the exemption for amateur radio fees because in creating legislation allowing the FCC to charge fees, Congress never indicated hams should be exempt. So potentially, we could see some lobbying effort to get the act that enabled the FCC fees amended to exempt hams. What else have you got for us tonight, Frankie?
Well, this was the 20th anniversary of amateur radio on the International Space Station. The Amateur Radio on the International Space Station organization, known as ARRS, organized an anniversary treat for hams back on Earth with a slew of photos transmitted using slow scan TV. software that receives broadcast images picked up by ham radio operators. These are just some of those transmitted between Christmas and New Year's at the end of 2020.
So, Frankie, tonight's episode of What Hams Do is focusing on the value of mobile emergency communications in amateur radio. In other words, hams who have radios in their cars and use them to practice in emergency drills and serve as backup communications during a real emergency. In your amateur radio career, have you had the opportunity to work with folks using mobile rigs that way?
Well, Jay, in our family car, we have a mobile radio set up to listen often as we drive. Also, my brother KE8GTT and I have worked as part of special event communications team for a local 4th of July parade using our own handheld radios. It was a very fun way to hone in our skills in the case of a real emergency, as we could be the eyes and ears for net control.
That's really interesting to know, Frankie. And as always, it's a great pleasure to see you, and I hope you'll join us for our next What Hams Do show, which will be on a subject close to your heart: ham radio operators as citizen scientists.
That is a very exciting topic, and I would love to share more about it because citizen science is really how I got into ham radio. And thank you so much again for having me for What Hams Do.
We'll have that conversation next month. See you then, Frankie. Finally, COVID-19 is attacking many in the amateur radio hobby, and sadly taking many lives. A few weeks ago, we noted with deep sadness the passing of the Philadelphia County Emergency Coordinator, Harvey Kolodner, WA3GTL. Harvey was a friend and a mentor, and temporarily I and Philadelphia's former emergency coordinator, Patrick, W3HPG, will be taking up some of Harvey's responsibilities. For those of you who are not hams, I wanted to tell you that when one of our ranks passes away, we say they've become a silent key. It refers to the Morse code devices we call keys that many of us use in communicating on the airwaves. And Harvey's key is now silent. Rest in peace, my friend. We'll return with the rest of tonight's show right after this message from the ARRL.
He has spoken with astronauts and cosmonauts,
W5 Lima Foxtrot Lima in the spacecraft Columbia.
bounced signals off meteors and the moon, joked with rock stars, country stars, heard the cosmic songs of the real stars, and tickled the ionosphere, and he never left the ground. He's a radio ham. Learn how at helloradio.org.
Because of the potential restrictions on the use of amateur radio mobile operations in any new legislation before the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, we wanted to focus on the value of ham radio mobile operations. So we have 3 guests in tonight's program. One is Bob Familio, amateur radio licensee K2RSJ, who is a practicing attorney, a first responder in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, and vice director of the ARRL's Mid-Atlantic region. Also with us is David Herzog. He manages Red Cross emergency communications in all of Pennsylvania except Philadelphia and its surrounding counties. And finally, the guy in the car with the mobile radio, David Flad, the emergency coordinator for Chester County. David will tell us about the real experiences in real emergencies that he's had. David is in charge of the Chester County Amateur Radio Emergency Service, which is activated by the county's Department of Emergency Services and the Red Cross as well. But first, Bob Familio. And my first question to Bob was, why shouldn't amateur radio operations be considered distracted driving?
Well, because there is a fundamental difference, Jay, between what radio amateurs do with a two-way radio and what an average driver might do using a typical cell phone device, such as this device here, where you have to look at it to make a call or to do a text message, which is a real big problem because people have to enter, they have to look at the screen. Ham radio operators are using two-way radios. They're not dialing into the phone system. They're not sending text or email. They're picking up a microphone on a two-way radio, such as this typical mic. This happens to be an amateur radio mic from a radio that I have. And they press a button and they talk. They don't need to take their eyes from the road. They don't need to do anything more than talk in the microphone by pushing a button. You don't need to see that button to talk.
The reason Pennsylvania and other states are enacting distracted driving legislation is more than the obvious need to stop people from texting and driving or looking at cell phones to dial numbers and that sort of thing. It's also because Congress has said if they don't, they won't get their share of federal highway funding. But some states have exempted mobile amateur radio operators and their two-way radios and have indeed gotten their funding. Still, I wondered if there's evidence that might show ham radio operations in a car was as dangerous as cell phone operations.
Well, that's a good question, because the answer is there is no evidence. And even more so, the American Radio Relay League of the National Association for Amateur Radio inquired, I think it was 2012, the National Safety Council, asking for evidence, if any there may be, about use of amateur radio or two-way radios of any sorts, whether it's a tow truck or whatever, using a radio as opposed to a phone. And there was no evidence. We thought there might be some, but there is plenty of course, evidence about distracted driving with cell phones. And it's mainly texting, but it can be telephone calls as well, because you're dialing a phone. You take your eyes off the road. So there is a substantial difference, and there really isn't any documented evidence about public danger from drivers using a two-way radio as opposed to a cell phone or cell phone-like device for texting or email or doing other things that require you to look at the screen, even for 5 seconds. That's dangerous, and amateur radio doesn't engage in that kind of activity. And that's why some states have found that they can exempt that kind of operation, and it has other public benefits to have amateur radio operators allowed to use the radio while driving.
So let's talk about those other public benefits. It is a primary reason why Congress created the amateur service.
Well, the very purpose under the federal law that created the amateur radio service, the very purpose of amateur radio is to provide emergency communications to the public in times of need, and also to have trained radio operators. They use the term the pool of trained radio operators in time of public need. So ham radio operators operate their radios without pecuniary interest. It means they don't get paid for it. They don't use it for business. It's not for taking calls during the day for your office. It's actually to learn the art of two-way radio and to understand procedures.
K2RSJ Mobile, go ahead.
Yeah, my name's Kurt. I'm down here in Delaware County. I'm right south of the airport, about maybe about 3 miles.
Yeah, very good. I am up here in Broomall, Delaware County, so not too far from you, but you sound fantastic.
Now, the typical ham driving down the road talking is either talking with another, it's certainly another amateur radio operator, but they are enhancing their skills. They're, I would say, enjoying the use of the radio, but that is one way that we enhance our skills so that when we do come across an incident or are called up in emergencies, which includes storms, hurricanes, tornadoes, ice storms, things that in which general communications, normal communications fail. And that includes cell phones, by the way, since their towers typically have to be connected by wireline. Amateur radio operators are well known for providing emergency communications as a backup to the backup for public safety groups. Most counties in Pennsylvania, certainly, the amateur radio emergency service is well regulated and coordinated with emergency service. I'm active in those services and can attest that we drill regularly and use our radios in the car to make sure our equipment's working and that we know how to use it properly and safely.
Thanks, Bob. Now, David Flad, the Chester County Emergency Coordinator, has himself been called up in a number of real incidents and emergencies in recent years. Mobile operations are crucial to meet the needs of the Chester County Department of Emergency Services and the Red Cross.
So ARES, or ARES, is the Amateur Radio Emergency Service. And our role is to provide disaster or other communication support And in my role in Chester County, we provide backup or alternate communications for the Chester County Department of Emergency Services.
Now, the thing about your background is that you do this on a regular basis in real emergencies. Can you give us a couple of examples of that?
Sure. Probably 2 years now, there was a relatively significant nursing home fire in Westchester itself. And part of that was a huge fire. It made the national news. But our role in that activity was to stage our equipment at a temporary shelter location where they were moving all the residents out of the home temporarily.
Now, to do that, you use a mobile radio in your car. Is that correct?
I have a GoKit radio, but en route to every location, we have the mobile radio, and we use that to help us get there, find parking, and address other issues while we're en route.
The use of the mobile radio is the issue that we're discussing today. Why is it important to have it?
Well, in my case, as the emergency coordinator, and also as an operator even before this role, we get dispatched out, and you're going to take a particular route of travel based on what you know at the time. A lot of times you'll get some feedback en route, especially if there's 2 or 3 of us going to a similar location. Don't go this way, the road's closed, it's flooded. Don't go that way, it's blocked by trees or wires and things like that. So we use it a lot to communicate just issues getting to where you're going. And then sometimes we get told you're going to location A, and then en route it's like, no, we want to reroute you, have you go to location B instead. We have an operating position inside the emergency services building right next to the 911 center. So typically especially like for this fire, we had somebody who was staffing that location as well as operators moving to the shelter location.
Now, you don't decide to go out and use your mobile radio in an emergency by yourself. You get instructions from someone. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. We're always dispatched by someone at Department of Emergency Services. In the case of the fire, it was the watch officer on duty who was requested by the Red Cross to have us go staff their shelter. Or their staging area in that case.
And what kind of information do you feed back once you get to a location like that?
Typically, we're going to do things like give them status reports. How busy is the location? For a standard shelter, like winter emergency, that sort of thing, it's client counts. Do you need food? Again, it's an adjunct path to get to communicate with DES instead of tying up their public service radio.
DES is the Department of Emergency Services. Okay.
Yes.
So give us another example of an emergency you've worked on for the Department of Emergency Services in Aries.
As far as an emergency during the ice storm, probably 4 years ago now, I believe, that was another case where we were staffing a shelter, and we staffed a local shelter at a local high school. That one actually had to be moved from the primary location to a secondary because of a power issue. And then we staffed a major center in the middle of Westchester where they started feeding everybody from remote shelters into a single large shelter at that location.
Did your mobile radio play any role in those events?
Absolutely. In the local case, there was a lot of communication back and forth, especially when we had to change where we were going to be set up, because that required notifying the public that instead of being located at a high school, we're now located at an intermediate school. And in the case of the ice storm, most of that was communicating which roads you could use and how to get there and make sure you could get there safely.
You know, it's interesting. People watching this are going to say, well, why don't you just use a cell phone?
Cell phone is actually more difficult to use under those circumstances. Amateur radio, the benefit of that is it's a broadcast network. So you have advantage of other operators who are out there, whether they're stationary or mobile, can give you information. In addition, the radio, a lot of us have our radios set up to give GPS coordinates as we're traveling through automatic position reporting, or APRS. When we have somebody sitting in the operating station over in Westchester, they can see where all the operators are coming and going. So that way, typically, if we're en route and we're supposed to be there in 20 minutes and we're not there yet, they can look at a map and say, gee, Dave, you're stuck here. Is there an issue?
I would also think if you have to pick up a cell phone, that becomes part of the distracted driving issue, don't you think?
Absolutely. The amateur radio is sitting on our standard comms frequencies all the time. You pick it up, you push the talk. There is no look down, dial a number, take your eyes off the road kind of thing. You can drive and pick it up and talk, and you're still looking at the road.
David Flad, thank you for your service in Chester County. Now, our next guest is David Herzog. I'll let him tell you about his role in emergency communications in the Red Cross.
I'm a volunteer at the American Red Cross in Pennsylvania, and my role is the emergency communications lead for the greater PA region, and that covers 61 of the 67 counties in Pennsylvania.
David Herzog explained in some detail what it is the Red Cross actually does in emergencies.
Well, I don't know how much the folks listening to the podcast are familiar with the Red Cross, but as you know, we respond to all the types of disasters that you see on TV, the wildfires, the floods, the hurricanes, and all sort of tragic incidents where people lose their homes and even worse in many cases. And a lot of times we set up shelters, again, pre-COVID. We would set up a shelter in a community center or what have you to house people that are involved in the incident, house them temporarily. Once we do that, we're responsible for the well-being of those clients, as we call them. And that means feeding them, housing them, making sure that they get their prescriptions that they may have lost in the incident, the fire or what have you. And so that all requires communication to do all of that stuff, particularly if it's an incident where the commercially available communication infrastructures are not available or are sparsely available. We still need to get the job done. And you can't get the job done without communicating between the parties that need to get that work completed.
The Red Cross regularly has drills to maintain their readiness for disasters and emergencies. They have a mutual assistance agreement with the ARRL, the National Association for Amateur Radio, and the Amateur Radio Emergency Service, ARRS. The Red Cross requests ARRS members in these drills to either bring their own mobile equipment, radios and antennas, to Red Cross cars and trucks, or bring their own radio-equipped vehicles and participate in these drills. And as we heard David Flad from Chester County report, they participate in real emergencies.
Can I share a story with you? I've been with the Red Cross about 4 years, and I've only had my amateur radio license. I'm KC3KAG is my call sign. And I've only had my license about 2.5 years, so I'm still learning the radio operations of amateur radio. But what impressed me was when I heard on the news that during the hurricane in Puerto Rico several years ago, that island was decimated, as we all know, and communications were down. Nothing was working. And the ARRL put out a call to amateur radio operators to go down there for a month or two to provide emergency communications, and this included the Red Cross. We have something called the Safe and Well system in the Red Cross, and what that is, it allows people that are involved in an incident that may be homeless because of the incident, their house is washed away in a storm or what have you, to put their information into a secure system, and then it allows relatives and friends and other people to know that those folks are okay, they're being taken care of. It's a short, like a messaging system, if you will, but a very secure one. We asked the ARRL, the amateur radio operators in the Puerto Rico flood, to actually go down and provide that service for them. And they did. But when they got there, what I read later was that the police, the fire, any of the EMSs, they had no radio communication down there. And so the hams split up and did some parts for the Red Cross. They did other parts for the police, other parts for the fire, and so forth. So that brought forth the example of what amateur radio can do during an emergency, and it just hit home with me. And I said, this is something I want to learn more about, and that's why I got my license. And I really enjoy having the opportunity to being able to apply emergency communications via amateur radio through the Red Cross and to help communications when they're needed during an incident.
Dave Herzog, I'd like to thank you for your volunteer service in helping to keep Pennsylvanians safe in the case of emergencies, and for your participation and involvement with the Amateur Radio Emergency Service to make sure we're prepared when disaster strikes. One thing we've learned is that it's not a matter of if it will happen, but rather when. So it's our hope that our legislators in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania will recognize the important role ham radio operators play in keeping us safe, and that they'll exempt FCC licensed amateur radio operators so they can continue to use their push-to-talk microphones in their cars and trucks in the service of their fellow citizens. Well, that brings tonight's program to a conclusion. There are so many reasons people get involved in amateur radio, and certainly participating in emergency services is among them. In our next program, we'll be looking at the role ham radio operators play as citizen scientists. It's involving a lot of young people in this amazing hobby. Now, if you want to get started in this amazing hobby, just search the web for Getting Started in Ham Radio. A link to the page on the ARRL website about how to get started is in the description below this video. For now, on behalf of the entire Eastern Pennsylvania ARRL team, thank you so much for watching this edition of What Hams Do. If you like our show, subscribe to this channel and click the notification bell so you know when our next program is published. Oh, and don't forget to share the link for this show with a friend. This is Jay Silber saying 73. That's the way we hams say goodbye. And reminding you that this isn't your grandfather's amateur radio. Bye, everyone.